What happens when silence becomes more terrifying than any scream? When the absence of sound becomes the loudest warning of all? Tonight, I'll tell you about Charlotte Williams, a woman who discovered that sometimes the most dangerous visitors are the ones who never announce their arrival. Charlotte had moved to the remote cabin in the hills of Vermont, seeking peace after her messy divorce. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and that's exactly how she wanted it. The cabin sat on 40 acres of dense woodland, surrounded by towering pine trees that blocked out most of the sunlight during the day, and all of the moonlight at night. For the first month, everything was perfect. Charlotte would wake up to the sound of birds chirping, spend her days writing her novel, and fall asleep to the gentle rustling of leaves. But then, the footprints appeared. It was a Tuesday morning in October when Charlotte first noticed them. She had stepped onto her front porch with her morning coffee when she saw them clearly pressed into the soft earth below her porch steps. Boot prints. Size 11, maybe 12. Fresh, with deep treads that hadn't been there the night before. Charlotte's heart began to race. She lived alone, had no visitors, and certainly hadn't invited anyone over. She grabbed her phone and called the local sheriff's office, but Deputy Jackson just laughed it off. Probably just a hiker who got lost, Miss Williams. Nothing to worry about in these parts. But Charlotte was worried, because as she examined the prints more carefully, she noticed something strange. The footprints led from the tree line, straight to her porch, and stopped. There were no prints leading away. It was as if whoever made them had simply vanished. That night, Charlotte barely slept. Every sound made her jump. Every creak of the old cabin made her heart pound. She kept her bedroom curtains tightly closed, afraid to look outside. When morning came, she rushed to the front porch, praying the footprints had been her imagination. They weren't. If anything, they were deeper now. And there were more of them. The same pattern, from the tree line to her porch. But this time, there were prints around the sides of the cabin too. Someone had been circling her home. Charlotte called Deputy Jackson again, more frantically this time. He agreed to come out, but when he arrived that afternoon, he seemed unconcerned. Could be anyone, Miss Williams. Maybe someone checking on the property, or a delivery person who came to the wrong address. But Charlotte knew better. She lived at the end of a private road, with a locked gate and no trespassing signs posted everywhere. No one came here by accident. That evening, Charlotte decided to stay awake. She positioned herself by the living room window, with a clear view of the front yard, and waited. The hours passed slowly. Midnight came and went, then 1 a.m., then 2. At exactly 3:17 a.m., she saw him. A figure emerged from the tree line, tall and thin, wearing dark clothing that seemed to blend with the shadows. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as she watched him approach. He walked with purpose, directly toward her porch, his movements slow but deliberate. Charlotte grabbed her phone to call for help, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial. When she looked up again, the man was standing at the bottom of her porch steps. He stood perfectly still, facing her front door, as if he was waiting for something. Minutes passed. The man didn't move, didn't knock, didn't call out. He just stood there. Charlotte watched in growing terror as the hours crawled by. The man remained motionless, like a statue, until the first rays of dawn began to creep through the trees. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked back into the forest. The next morning, Charlotte found the same pattern of footprints, but now she knew who was making them. She spent the day at the local electronics store, buying security cameras, motion sensors, and floodlights. If this man wanted to play games, she would be ready. That night, Charlotte set up her equipment for cameras covering every angle of her property, motion-activated lights, and a direct line to the sheriff's office. She felt more confident, more in control. But when she reviewed the footage the next morning, her confidence shattered. The cameras had captured everything. The man emerging from the trees, walking to her porch, standing in front of her door. But there was something wrong with the footage. The timestamp showed that the man had been there for 6 hours, from 3 a.m. until sunrise. But in the video, he never moved. Not once. He stood in the exact same position, in the exact same posture, for 6 straight hours. No shifting, no breathing, no natural human movement whatsoever. It was as if someone had taken a photograph and stretched it across 6 hours of video. Charlotte played the footage over and over again, zooming in, slowing it down, looking for any sign of movement. There was none. But the most disturbing part was his face. Even in the grainy night vision footage, Charlotte could see that he was staring directly at her front door, with an expression of intense concentration, as if he was listening for something, or waiting for someone to come out. If you didn't forget, then subscribe our channel. Charlotte called Deputy Jackson immediately, her voice barely above a whisper as she explained what she had seen. That's not possible, Miss Williams," Jackson replied. "Nobody can stand that still for 6 hours. The cameras must be malfunctioning." But Charlotte knew what she had seen, and she knew the cameras were working perfectly, because they had captured the raccoons playing near her garbage cans, the owls swooping through her yard, even the leaves falling from the trees. Everything moved naturally, except for him. That day, Charlotte researched the history of her property. What she found made her blood run cold. 50 years ago, a man named William Harwick had lived in a cabin on this very spot. He was a hermit, someone the locals described as peculiar and unsettling. According to old newspaper reports, Harwick had become convinced that someone was trying to break into his home. He would stand guard on his porch every night, waiting for the intruders to arrive. One morning, neighbors found his cabin burned to the ground. Harwick's body was discovered on the front porch, still in his guard position, burned beyond recognition. The fire had been ruled an accident, but some locals whispered that Harwick had set it himself, unable to distinguish between reality and his paranoid delusions. Charlotte's hands trembled as she read the final detail of the report. William Harwick had been wearing size 11 work boots, the same size as the prints outside her cabin. That night, Charlotte couldn't bring herself to check the cameras. She barricaded herself in her bedroom, pushing furniture against the door, and waited for morning. But around 3 a.m., she heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, walking around her cabin. The sounds continued for hours, circling the cabin, stopping occasionally, then starting again. But they were different now, heavier, more purposeful. When dawn finally broke, Charlotte forced herself to check the cameras. What she saw defied all logic, all reason, all understanding of the natural world. The man was there as always, standing motionless in front of her door, staring with that same intense expression. But this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, stood another figure, and another, and another. A crowd of motionless people, all facing her door, all waiting in perfect silence. Charlotte counted them on the screen. 12 figures in total, all standing as still as statues, all staring at her front door with the same unnaturally focused expression. And when she looked more carefully at their faces, she recognized some of them from old photographs she had seen at the local library. Previous owners of the land, people who had lived and died on this property over the past century. All of them waiting, all of them watching. Charlotte packed her belongings that very morning. She couldn't explain what was happening, couldn't rationalize it, couldn't make it fit into her understanding of reality. But she knew she had to leave. As she loaded the last of her suitcases into her car, she noticed something that made her freeze with terror. New footprints, leading from her front porch to her car and circling it completely, as if they had been inspecting her vehicle, planning something. Charlotte jumped into her car and drove away, never looking back, never returning to collect the belongings she had left behind. 6 months later, Charlotte received a call from Deputy Jackson. Her cabin had burned down in the middle of the night, under mysterious circumstances. "Strangest thing, Miss Williams," Jackson said. "The fire department found evidence that someone had been living there, but we never saw any cars, never had any reports of trespassers. They found footprints all around the property, dozens of them, from different people. But here's the weird part, they were all facing outward, as if whoever was there was watching the road, waiting for someone to come back." Charlotte never returned to Vermont. She moved across the country, to a busy city, surrounded by people and lights and noise. But sometimes, late at night, when the city grows quiet, she still checks her windows, because she learned something in that cabin that she'll never forget. Sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't what knocks on your door. It's what stands outside, waiting patiently for you to open it. And some visitors never truly leave. The old grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the Victorian house that 17-year-old David Thompson had called home for the past 3 months. Moving to this small Canadian town of Millbrook had been his mother's idea after his father's sudden death. She thought a fresh start would help them both heal, but David found nothing comforting about this place. The house creaked and groaned like an old man's bones, and shadows seemed to dance in corners where no light should cast them. But it wasn't the typical sounds of an aging house that kept David awake most nights. It was something far more unsettling. His bedroom faced the backyard, where ancient oak trees swayed in the wind like skeletal fingers reaching toward his second-story window. During the day, the view was pleasant enough, but when darkness fell, those same trees became ominous silhouettes against the star-filled sky. David pulled his blanket up to his chin and tried to focus on his phone, scrolling through social media posts from his friends back in Toronto. He missed his old life desperately. His best friend Jake had been texting him about a party they were planning, making David feel even more isolated in this strange new place. The digital clock on his nightstand glowed 3:16 a.m. He was about to put his phone away when he heard it, a soft, melodic whistle coming from outside his window. It wasn't a bird or the wind through the trees. This was deliberate, almost like someone was whistling a lullaby. David sat up in bed, his heart beginning to race. He listened carefully, holding his breath. The whistling continued, a gentle tune that seemed oddly familiar, though he couldn't place where he'd heard it before. Curiosity overcoming his initial fear, David slipped out of bed and crept toward the window. The hardwood floor felt cold against his bare feet. He carefully pulled back the heavy curtain just enough to peer outside. The backyard was bathed in pale moonlight, casting long shadows across the overgrown grass. The old oak trees swayed gently, but he couldn't see anyone who might be responsible for the whistling. Yet the sound continued, seeming to come from directly below his window. After several minutes, the whistling stopped as abruptly as it had begun. David waited, pressed against the glass, but heard nothing more except the usual night sounds of insects and rustling leaves. Eventually, he returned to bed, convincing himself it must have been his imagination or perhaps a neighbor taking a late-night walk. The next morning at breakfast, his mother Carol was already dressed for work at the local library. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes that seemed to grow more pronounced each day since they'd moved here. "Did you sleep well, honey?" she asked, pouring herself another cup of coffee. David hesitated. "Did you hear anything strange last night? Like whistling?" Carol paused, the coffee pot hovering over her mug. "Whistling? No, I didn't hear anything." "Why?" "I thought I heard someone whistling outside my window around 3 a.m. It was probably nothing." His mother's expression grew concerned. Maybe it was just the wind through the trees. "This old house makes all sorts of sounds. I'm still getting used to it myself." David nodded, not entirely convinced, but not wanting to worry her further. She had enough stress adapting to her new job and dealing with her own grief. That day at Millbrook High School, David tried to focus on his classes, but his mind kept drifting back to the whistling. During lunch, he sat alone at a corner table, picking at his sandwich while watching his classmates chat and laugh in their established friend groups. "Mind if I sit here?" David looked up to see a girl with shoulder-length blonde hair and friendly green eyes standing beside his table with her lunch tray. She was one of the few students who had made any effort to welcome him since his arrival. "Sure, Jessica." "Thanks." Jessica Williams was from a family that had lived in Millbrook for generations. She was kind, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in helping David adjust to his new environment. "You look like you didn't sleep much," she observed, taking a seat across from him. "Just having trouble adjusting, I guess. Do you know anything about the history of our house?" The one on Maple Street. Jessica's expression grew thoughtful. The old Thompson place. Wait, that's funny. Thompson is your last name, too. Yeah, my mom thought it was meant to be when she saw the listing. Said it was a sign from my dad. That house has been empty for years. The family who lived there before, well, there was an accident. A teenage boy fell from his bedroom window on the second floor. He didn't survive. David felt a chill run down his spine. When did this happen? Maybe 10 years ago. His name was Thomas, I think. Thomas Bennett. He was about your age. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. David couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica's story was somehow connected to what he'd experienced the night before. When he got home, he found his mother in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Mom, did the real estate agent mention anything about the previous owners? Carol looked up from chopping vegetables. Not really. Just that it had been on the market for a while. Why do you ask? David decided not to mention what Jessica had told him. Just curious about the house's history. That night, David went to bed earlier than usual, hoping to avoid any repetition of the previous night's incident. But as the hours ticked by, he found himself wide awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to every sound the house made. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, then 1 o'clock, then 2. David's eyelids were finally growing heavy when the digital clock displayed 3:17 a.m. The whistling began again. This time it was louder, more distinct. The same melodic tune, but now David could make out what sounded like words being whistled. He crept to the window again, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled back the curtain. The backyard looked exactly the same as the night before, but the whistling seemed to be coming from directly below his window. David pressed his face against the glass, trying to see into the shadows cast by the house. Then the whistling changed. Instead of the wordless melody, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A voice, soft and plaintive, calling his name. David, David. But it wasn't just any voice. It sounded exactly like his mother. David stumbled backward from the window, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The voice continued calling his name, the sound drifting up from the darkness below. David, come here, sweetheart. Come to the window. It was definitely his mother's voice, with the same gentle tone she used when she wanted to comfort him. But his mother was asleep in her bedroom down the hall. He'd seen her go to bed hours ago. With shaking hands, David crept out of his room and tiptoed down the hallway to his mother's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear her steady breathing from within. He carefully pushed the door open just enough to confirm that she was indeed fast asleep, completely undisturbed. But outside his window, the voice that sounded exactly like hers continued to call his name. David returned to his room, his mind racing. He stayed away from the window this time, sitting on his bed with his back against the headboard. The calling continued for what felt like hours, sometimes sounding urgent, sometimes pleading. David, please. I need you to come here. It's important. Several times, the voice was so convincing that David almost found himself moving toward the window before catching himself. There was something hypnotic about it, something that made him want to obey despite his rational mind screaming warnings. Finally, as dawn began to break, the voice faded away, leaving David exhausted and thoroughly shaken. The next morning, he looked terrible. His mother noticed immediately. David, you look awful. Are you feeling sick? I didn't sleep well again, he admitted. Maybe you should stay home from school today. I can call and let them know you're not feeling well. David was tempted, but he knew staying home alone in the house would only make him more anxious. No, I'll be okay. I just need some coffee. At school, Jessica took one look at him and immediately grew concerned. David, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Her choice of words made him flinch. Can I trust you with something that's going to sound completely crazy? Of course. David told her everything about the whistling and the voice that sounded like his mother. Jessica listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. David, she said quietly when he finished, I think you need to know more about what happened to Thomas Bennett. She pulled out her phone and showed him a newspaper article from 10 years ago. The headline read, "Local teen dies in mysterious fall." The police ruled it an accident, Jessica explained, but there were strange details that never made sense. Thomas's mother said she heard him talking to someone in his room that night, but when she went to check on him, she found his window open and him lying on the ground below. David's hands trembled as he read the article. Did they ever figure out who he was talking to? That's the weird part. His mother swore she heard her own voice coming from his room, calling his name, but she was downstairs the entire time. The similarity to David's experience was impossible to ignore. You think something in that house, something that can mimic voices. I don't know what to think, but I'm worried about you. Maybe you should tell your mother what's happening. David shook his head. She's already dealing with so much. I can't add this to her stress. Then what are you going to do? I don't know, but I'm not going near that window tonight. Despite his resolution, David found himself drawn to his bedroom window as 3:17 a.m. approached. He'd barricaded himself in his room, pushing his dresser against the door and staying as far from the window as possible. When the whistling began, followed by his mother's voice calling his name, David covered his ears and tried to focus on anything else. But the voice was persistent, growing more desperate with each passing minute. David, please. I'm hurt. I need your help. The pleading tone was heart-wrenching, and despite knowing it wasn't really his mother, David felt an overwhelming urge to respond. The voice knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. Your father wants to see you, David. He's here with me. Come to the window. At the mention of his father, David broke, tears streaming down his face. He found himself moving toward the window despite every rational thought telling him not to. His hand was reaching for the window latch when his phone rang, startling him out of his trance-like state. It was Jessica. David, are you okay? I've been worried about you all day. Her voice, real and concerned, helped clear his head. He stepped away from the window, his whole body shaking. It's happening again, he whispered into the phone. The voice, it mentioned my father. Listen to me carefully, Jessica said firmly. Whatever is out there, it's not your mother and it's not your father. It's something that wants to hurt you, just like it hurt Thomas Bennett. The voice outside grew more agitated, more demanding. David, come here right now. But this time, David heard something in the tone that his mother would never use with him. An underlying anger, a threatening edge that made him realize how close he'd come to making a terrible mistake. I need to research this house, David told Jessica. There has to be more to the story. The library has old records and newspapers. I can meet you there tomorrow after school. David spent the rest of the night with his phone pressed to his ear, with Jessica staying on the line until dawn broke and the voice finally faded away. The next afternoon, David and Jessica spent hours at the library going through old records. Carol was working in another section, giving them access to archived materials that weren't available to the general public. What they discovered was disturbing. The house on Maple Street had a long history of unexplained incidents. 3 different families had lost teenage children over the past 50 years, all under similar circumstances. All had fallen from second-story windows during the night. Look at this, Jessica said, pointing to a faded newspaper clipping from 1985. Michael Patterson, age 16, found dead below his bedroom window. His mother reported hearing voices calling his name the night he died. Another article from 1998 told a similar story about 15-year-old Robert Chin. His parents had heard what sounded like family members calling to him from outside, but when they checked, everyone was accounted for inside the house. Whatever this thing is, Jessica said, it's been hunting teenagers in that house for decades. David felt sick. So I'm just the latest target. Not if we figure out how to stop it. They searched for any references to the land the house was built on, eventually finding records from the 1800s. The property had once been part of a larger estate owned by a man named William Blackwood. According to historical accounts, Blackwood had been a cruel man who had lost his own teenage son in an accident. Consumed by grief and rage, He had become obsessed with the idea that other families shouldn't get to keep their children when his was gone. He died in 1889. Jessica read from a historical society document, but locals reported strange incidents around his property for years afterward. Children would hear voices calling them into the woods, but parents would find the voices weren't coming from any living person. So this Blackwood guy is still somehow hunting kids? It seems like it. And now his old property includes your house. That evening, David prepared for what he hoped would be his final confrontation with whatever was calling to him from outside his window. He'd researched everything he could about dealing with malevolent spirits, though he still wasn't entirely sure that's what he was dealing with. Jessica had wanted to stay with him, but he couldn't risk putting her in danger. Instead, she was on standby with her phone, ready to call for help if needed. At 3:17 a.m., the whistling began as always, but this time David was ready. Instead of hiding or trying to ignore it, he went to the window and opened it wide. "I know who you are, William Blackwood," he called out into the darkness. "I know what you're trying to do." The whistling stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then a voice rose from the shadows below, but it was no longer his mother's gentle tone. This voice was harsh, ancient, and filled with malice. "You don't belong here, boy. This is my domain." "This isn't your domain anymore," David replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "You died over 100 years ago. Your son is gone, but that doesn't give you the right to take other people's children." A cold wind began to blow, even though the night had been still moments before. The temperature in David's room dropped dramatically, and his breath became visible in small puffs. "You think you can defy me?" The voice was growing louder, more threatening. "Look what happened to the others who tried to resist." "I'm not Thomas Bennett or Michael Patterson or Robertson," David said firmly, "and I'm not afraid of you." But even as he said it, David could feel fear creeping up his spine. The shadows below his window seemed to be moving, coalescing into a darker shape. "Come down here, boy. Let's finish this properly." "No," David said. "If you want me, you'll have to come up here." It was a calculated risk. David had read that some spirits were bound to specific locations and couldn't enter homes unless invited. He was gambling that Blackwood was limited to the grounds outside the house. The voice roared in frustration, and suddenly every window in the house began rattling violently. David could hear his mother stirring in her room down the hall. "David," she called out. "What's happening?" Before he could answer, the voice outside began mimicking his mother again, but this time David could hear the difference. There was something off about the intonation, something not quite human in the way it formed words. "David, come outside. There's something I need to show you." His mother appeared in his doorway, looking confused and frightened. "David, who is that? Why does it sound like me?" Finally, David had a witness. His mother could hear it too. "Mom, don't listen to it. It's not you. It's something that's been trying to lure me outside." Carol's face went pale as understanding dawned. "That's why you've looked so tired lately. How long has this been going on?" 3 nights. "Mom, we need to leave this house." But before Carol could respond, all the lights in the house went out. Emergency lighting from smoke detectors provided the only illumination, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The voice outside grew more agitated, switching between different people's voices now. David heard what sounded like his father's voice, then Jessica's, then voices of teachers and classmates from his old school in Toronto. "It's trying to confuse us," David told his mother. "Don't listen to anything it says." Carol grabbed her phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. The landline was also dead. "We need to get out of here," she said. They grabbed their coats and headed for the front door, but it wouldn't open. The lock mechanism seemed to be jammed, and even turning the deadbolt had no effect. "The back door," Carol suggested, but as they moved through the house, they could hear the voice following them, always seeming to come from just outside whatever window was nearest. It was as if the presence was circling the house, keeping pace with their movements inside. The back door was also mysteriously jammed. Every exit seemed to be blocked by some unseen force. What does it want? Carol asked, her voice trembling. It wants me to come outside, David admitted. It's been trying to get me to climb out my bedroom window for 3 nights. Like the boy who died here before us. David nodded grimly, and others before him. They retreated to the living room, which was in the center of the house, and had fewer windows. Carol lit some candles she found in a kitchen drawer, providing more stable light than the intermittent emergency lighting. There has to be something we can do, she said. Some way to make it leave us alone. David had been thinking the same thing. In all my research about the previous incidents, families always moved away afterward, but they never tried to actually confront whatever was causing the problem. What are you suggesting? I think I need to face it directly, not by going outside where it wants me, but by challenging it here in the house. Carol shook her head firmly. Absolutely not. I won't let you put yourself in danger. Mom, it's not going to stop. And next time, you might not be awake to witness it. It almost had me convinced to climb out the window tonight before Jessica called. As if summoned by the mention of her name, David's phone rang. It was Jessica. David, I can see strange lights around your house from the street. Are you okay? We're trapped inside, David explained quickly. All the doors are jammed, and that thing is circling the house. I'm calling the police. I don't think they'll be able to help with this, but stay on the line, okay? I need to try something. David walked back toward his bedroom, his mother and Jessica on the phone both protesting. But he had made up his mind. Standing at his open bedroom window, David called out into the night. William Blackwood, I challenge you. If you're so powerful, if you have the right to take lives, then face me directly. Stop hiding in shadows and using tricks. The wind picked up violently, and David could hear tree branches scraping against the side of the house. But slowly, a figure began to materialize in the yard below. It looked like a man, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with features that seemed to shift and blur in the moonlight. Its eyes glowed with a cold, malevolent light. You dare challenge me, boy? I do, David said, though his voice was shaking now. You've been preying on families for over a century. That ends tonight. You have no power over me. Maybe not, David admitted, but I have something you don't. And what is that? People who love me and want me to live. David turned to his mother, who had followed him despite her fear. Mom, I need you to do something for me. I need you to call my name. David, what are you planning? Trust me. When I tell you, call my name. Use your real voice, with all the love you have for me. And don't stop, no matter what happens. David turned back to the window. The figure in the yard was growing more solid, more menacing. You lost your son, David said to it. I understand that pain, even though I lost my father instead. But taking other people's children won't bring your son back. It just creates more pain, more loss. Silence, the figure roared. You know nothing of my pain. I know you've been hurting for over 100 years, but this isn't the answer. The figure began to rise from the ground, floating up toward David's window with arms outstretched like claws. Now, Mom, David shouted. Carol began calling his name, her voice filled with love and desperation. David, David, come away from the window. At the same time, Jessica's voice came through the phone, also calling his name with genuine concern and friendship. The effect was immediate. The rising figure stopped midair, as if struck by an invisible force. David could see confusion and pain in its glowing eyes. You hear that? David said to the spirit. That's what real love sounds like. That's what you've been trying to imitate, but you can't, because you've forgotten what love actually is. The figure wavered, its form becoming less solid. Your son wouldn't want this, David continued. No loving parent would want their child's death to cause the deaths of other children. You've dishonored his memory. No, the figure whispered, and for the first time, its voice sounded more human, more broken than threatening. Let him go, David said gently. Let your son rest in peace. And let yourself rest too. The figure looked up at David one more time, and in that moment, its features became clearer. David could see the face of a man consumed by grief and rage, but underneath that, the face of someone who had once been capable of love. I just wanted him back, the figure said, and its voice was now that of a broken father rather than a malevolent spirit. I know, David said softly, but this isn't the way. The figure began to fade, becoming more transparent with each passing second. As it did, David could see another, smaller figure appearing beside it, a teenage boy who looked remarkably like the man. The boy reached out and took his father's hand, and together they both became increasingly translucent until they disappeared entirely. The oppressive cold lifted from the house immediately. David could hear the grandfather clock ticking normally again, and when his mother tried the light switch, the electricity was working. They checked the front door, and it opened easily now. Jessica arrived minutes later, having run the 4 blocks from her house. She found David and Carol sitting on the front porch, both exhausted but relieved. Is it over? She asked. David nodded. I think so. William Blackwood found his son again. They're both at rest now. Over the following weeks, David and his mother decided to stay in the house. It felt different now, warmer, more welcoming. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the place since their arrival was completely gone. David slept peacefully through the night, and 3:17 a.m. came and went without incident. The only sounds outside his window were the natural ones of wind through leaves and the occasional car passing on the street. One evening, about a month later, Jessica joined David and his mother for dinner. As they were cleaning up afterward, Jessica asked a question that had been bothering her. David, how did you know that confronting the spirit directly would work? What if it had been able to reach you at the window? David considered the question carefully. I think it was already losing power. Every night, it was getting more desperate, more angry. That usually means something is fighting a losing battle. But what changed? You did, David said simply. When you called me that night and broke me out of its trance, you proved that it couldn't completely control me. And when you and Mom both called my name at the end, with real love and concern, it showed the spirit what it had been missing, what it had forgotten. Carol put her arm around her son's shoulders. I'm proud of you for being so brave, but promise me you'll never do anything that dangerous again. David smiled. I promise. Besides, I think we've had our share of supernatural encounters for one lifetime. As they settled in to watch a movie together, David felt something he hadn't experienced since his father's death, a sense of home, not just the physical building they lived in, but the feeling of belonging, of being surrounded by people who cared about him. Outside, the wind rustled through the oak trees, but it was a peaceful sound now, free of any menace or hidden threats. The house on Maple Street had finally become what it was always meant to be, a place where a family could live safely and happily together. And if sometimes, late at night, David thought he heard a gentle whistling from the yard, it was no longer a sound that filled him with dread. Instead, it reminded him that sometimes, even the most lost souls could find their way home. The autumn wind carried whispers through the empty streets of Millbrook, a small town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were harder to keep than promises. It was well past midnight when the Thompson family's silver Honda pulled into their quiet neighborhood. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows across the pavement, creating shapes that seemed to dance in the corner of your eye. David Thompson gripped the steering wheel tighter as he navigated the familiar streets. Something felt different tonight. Something felt wrong. "Dad, are we almost home?" asked 10-year-old Jamie from the back seat, her voice barely above a whisper. The family had been driving for hours, returning from David's mother's funeral in the neighboring state. The silence in the car was heavy, filled with grief and exhaustion. "Almost there, sweetheart," David replied, his voice hoarse from the long day. His wife Catherine sat beside him, staring blankly out the passenger window. Their teenage son Oliver had fallen asleep against the door, his headphones still playing soft music. As they turned onto Maple Street, their street, David noticed something odd. The The familiar glow of their porch light was missing. The house stood in complete darkness, like a black void against the night sky. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. Standing perfectly still in their driveway was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. The shadow stood motionless, facing their house, as if it had been waiting for their return. "Catherine," David whispered, his voice trembling. "Do you see that?" Catherine looked up from her thoughts, following her husband's gaze. Her breath caught in her throat. What is that thing?" The figure didn't move. It didn't turn to acknowledge their approaching car. It simply stood there, like a sentinel of darkness, guarding their home. David's hands began to shake as he slowed the car to a crawl. "Jamie, Oliver, stay in the car," he commanded, though his voice betrayed his fear. "What's wrong, Dad?" Jamie asked, sensing the tension in the vehicle. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just stay put." David reached for his phone, fingers fumbling with the flashlight function. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but when it hit the driveway, the figure was gone. Vanished, as if it had never been there at all. "Where did it go?" Catherine gasped, her eyes scanning the empty driveway. David's heart pounded in his chest. He drove the car slowly into the driveway, the headlights illuminating every corner, every shadow. Nothing. The space was completely empty. "Maybe we were just tired seeing things," he said, trying to convince himself as much as his family. But deep down, he knew he had seen. They parked the car and sat in silence for a moment, each family member lost in their own thoughts. The house loomed before them, dark and unwelcoming. David had forgotten to leave the porch light on before they left for the funeral, but somehow, that seemed like the least of their worries now. "Let's go inside," he said finally, try to sound braver than he felt. As they gathered their bags and walked toward the front door, none of them noticed the small red light blinking on their car's dashboard camera, the device that David had installed months ago for insurance purposes. The camera that had been recording everything. Inside the house, the familiar creaks and groans seemed amplified in the darkness. David fumbled for the light switches, and slowly their home came back to life. The warm glow of the lamps should have been comforting, but instead, it only seemed to emphasize the shadows that lurked in every corner. "I'll make some tea," Catherine offered, her voice shaky as she headed toward the kitchen. "Mom, I'm scared," Jamie admitted, clutching her small backpack against her chest. Oliver, now awake and confused, looked around the house with sleepy eyes. "Why is everyone acting so weird?" he asked, pulling out his earbuds. David knelt down beside Jamie, putting his hands on her shoulders. "There's nothing to be scared of, sweetheart. We're home now. We're safe." But as he spoke those words, a cold draft seemed to sweep through the house, extinguishing the flame of the candle Catherine had lit in the kitchen. The house plunged into darkness once again. "The power must be out," David said quickly, though the digital clocks were still glowing, and the refrigerator hummed quietly in the kitchen. That night, sleep came uneasily to the Thompson family. David found himself standing by the bedroom window, peering out at the driveway below. Everything appeared normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. At exactly 3:17 a.m., Jamie's scream pierced the silence of the house. David and Catherine rushed to her room, finding their daughter sitting up in bed, pointing at her window with the trembling finger. "It's there! It's outside my window!" she cried, tears streaming down her face. David looked out the second-story window, but saw only the empty yard below bathed in moonlight. "There's nothing there. Jamie, you had a nightmare." "No, Daddy. I saw it. The tall man. He was looking up at me." Catherine gathered Jamie into her arms, rocking her gently. "It's okay, baby. It was just a bad dream." But David noticed something that made his blood freeze. On the glass of Jamie's window, there was a handprint. Large, elongated, and definitely not made from inside the room. The next morning brought little relief. The family went through the motions of their daily routine, but everyone seemed on edge. David called in sick to work, unable to concentrate on anything but the events of the previous night. It was Oliver who suggested checking the dashcam footage. "Dad, remember you installed that camera in the car? Maybe it recorded something." David had almost forgotten about the device. They gathered around his laptop as he downloaded the footage from the previous night. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m., just as they were turning onto their street. The first few minutes of footage showed nothing unusual, just their car's approach to the house. But then there it was, clear as day on the screen, the tall figure standing in their driveway, exactly as they had seen it. "Oh my God," Catherine whispered, her hand covering her mouth. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. David fast-forwarded through the footage, and what he saw next made his stomach drop. The figure didn't simply disappear when he turned on the flashlight. Instead, frame by frame, it moved closer to the car. Each time David blinked, each time the camera briefly lost focus, the shadow advanced. In the final frames, before they got out of the car, the figure was standing directly beside the driver's side door, so close that it should have been touching David's shoulder. "How is this possible?" Oliver asked, his teenage bravado cracking. David rewound the footage, watching it again and again. The pattern was always the same. Blink. The figure moved closer. Blink. Closer still. It was as if the thing existed in the spaces between moments, in the gaps of human perception. "We need to call someone," Catherine said, her voice barely controlled. "Call who?" David replied. "The police." "And tell them what?" "That there's a shadow in our driveway that only moves when we're not looking." But even as he spoke, David was already reaching for his phone. Whatever this thing was, they needed help. Detective Amanda Shaw had seen a lot of strange things in her 15 years on the Millbrook police force, but the Thompson case was definitely a first. She sat in the family's living room, watching the dashcam footage for the third time. "I have to admit, this is unusual," she said, her professional demeanor masking her own unease. But there could be logical explanations. Camera glitches, reflections, even someone playing a prank. "A prank?" David's voice rose. "Detective, look at that footage. Tell me how someone could move like that without being seen." Shaw paused the video, studying the final frame where the figure appeared closest to the car. There was something unsettling about the shape, something that defied normal human proportions. "I'll file a report, Mr. Thompson. We'll increase patrols in your neighborhood. But honestly, there's not much more we can do with what we have here." After the detective left, the family felt more alone than ever. The official dismissal of their experience only served to amplify their fear. If the authorities couldn't help them, what could they do? That evening, as darkness fell over Millbrook, the Thompson family made a decision. They would take turns keeping watch, monitoring their driveway throughout the night, armed with cameras, flashlights, and a desperate hope that daylight would bring answers. David took the first shift, positioning himself at the living room window with a pair of binoculars and his phone ready to record. The street was quiet, typical for a weeknight in their suburban neighborhood. At 11:43 p.m., almost exactly 24 hours after their initial encounter, the figure appeared. This time, David was ready. He immediately began recording, his hand steadying as he focused on the dark shape in their driveway. The figure stood in the exact same position as before, tall and motionless, like a monument to darkness itself. David called out softly to his family, and soon Catherine and Oliver joined him at the window. Jamie was asleep upstairs, and they decided not to wake her. "There it is," David whispered, his voice barely audible. The three of them watched in horrified fascination as the figure remained perfectly still. Minutes passed, and nothing changed. David's phone battery was draining, but he kept recording. Then Oliver made a mistake. He blinked. In that fraction of a second, the figure moved. Not visibly, but somehow. They all knew it had gotten closer. "Did you see that?" Catherine gasped. I blinked," Oliver admitted, his face pale. David checked his phone recording. Sure enough, there was a slight variation in the figure's position. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. They conducted an experiment. Taking turns, they would deliberately blink, while the others watched. Each time, the figure advanced, slowly, methodically, as if feeding off their moments of visual darkness. "What does it want?" Catherine asked, her voice breaking. As if in response to her question, the figure began to change. Its head, which had been facing the house, slowly turned toward them. Even from their second-story window, they could feel its attention, cold and invasive, like ice water in their veins. David's phone buzzed with a low battery warning, and the screen flickered. In that moment of electronic distraction, the figure vanished completely. But this time, it didn't simply disappear from the driveway. Jamie's scream echoed through the house. They rushed to her room, finding her pressed against the wall, pointing at her closet door, which stood slightly ajar. "It's in there, Daddy. It's in my closet." David grabbed a baseball bat from Oliver's room, his heart pounding as he approached the closet. Catherine pulled Jamie behind her, while Oliver stood frozen in the doorway. With a deep breath, David yanked open the closet door. Empty. Nothing but Jamie's clothes and toys, hanging innocently in a small space. But on the closet floor, pressed into the carpet, were footprints. Large, elongated impressions that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The prints led from the closet, across Jamie's room, and stopped at her bed. "Pack some bags," David said, his voice hollow with defeat. "We're leaving. Now." The Thompson family spent the next 3 nights at Catherine's sister's house across town. They told no one the real reason for their sudden departure, inventing stories about home repairs and pest control. But even in the safety of another home, sleep came fitfully, and always with the feeling that something was watching from the shadows. On the 4th day, David decided he had to return to the house. They needed clothes, important documents, and some sense of normalcy. He went alone, against Catherine's protests, arriving at their home just as the sun was setting. The house felt different. Not just empty, but hollow, as if something essential had been drained from it. David moved quickly through the rooms, gathering what they needed, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to follow his movements. In Jamie's room, he paused. The footprints were still there, pressed into the carpet like permanent stains. But now, there were more of them. The prints circled her bed, approached her desk, even climbed up to her window. David's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. The thing had been in their house, exploring, learning, while they were away. He grabbed his phone and called Detective Shaw. "Detective, you need to see this. The thing, it was inside our house. There's evidence." "Mr. Thompson, I understand you're upset, but—" "Physical evidence. Detective Shaw. Footprints. In my daughter's room." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. David waited in his car, engine running, ready to flee if necessary. When Detective Shaw arrived, he led her quickly through the house, pointing out the various prints and disturbances he discovered. Shaw examined everything with professional skepticism, taking photographs and measurements. But David could see the doubt creeping into her expression. "Mr. Thompson, these could be anything. Maybe your daughter made them herself, playing some kind of game. Jamie weighs 60 pounds. Detective, look at the depth of these impressions. Look at the size." Shaw knelt beside the prints in Jamie's room, running her fingers along the edges. The impressions were indeed unusually deep, and the proportions were all wrong for a human foot. I'll have these analyzed," she said finally, though her tone suggested she was humoring him more than taking the evidence seriously. That night, despite their intention to stay away, the Thompson family returned home. They couldn't afford a hotel indefinitely, and some part of David refused to be driven from his own house by something he didn't understand. They implemented new security measures, motion sensor lights in every room, a sophisticated alarm system, cameras positioned to monitor every entrance. If this thing wanted to terrorize his family, David was determined to catch it in the act. The first 2 nights passed without incident. The family began to relax slightly, wondering if perhaps their visitor had moved on. But on the 3rd night, at exactly 11:47 p.m., the figure returned. This time, it wasn't alone. David's security cameras captured everything. The original figure stood in its usual position in the driveway, but now there were others. Tall shadows positioned around the house, like sentries standing guard. They didn't move, didn't interact with each other. They simply watched. "There's more of them," Oliver whispered, staring at the laptop screen in disbelief. The family huddled together in a master bedroom, watching their security feeds with growing terror. The figures remained motionless for hours, and just before dawn, they faded away like smoke in the wind. But they left behind more evidence of their presence. Handprints on windows, footprints in the garden, long scratches on the front door, as if something with claws had been testing the strength of the wood. Detective Shaw arrived the next morning with a small team of investigators. The physical evidence was undeniable now, too extensive and bizarre to dismiss as a prank or misunderstanding. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to be honest with you," Shaw said as they stood in the front yard, surveying the damage. "I've never seen anything like this. The patterns, the timing. It's not matching any known criminal behavior." "So what do we do?" Catherine asked, exhaustion evident in her voice. "I'm recommending you contact someone with specialized knowledge. There's a professor at the State University, Dr. Elizabeth Crane. She studies unusual phenomena." David felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that someone was finally taking them seriously, but dread at the implication that their situation was beyond normal law enforcement. Dr. Crane arrived that afternoon, a woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and an air of academic authority. She examined their evidence methodically, asking detailed questions and taking extensive notes. "What you're describing, and what I'm seeing here, it's consistent with reports I've encountered in other locations," she said finally. "Shadow entities, beings that exist in spaces between perception and reality." "Shadow entities?" David repeated, unsure whether to feel validated or terrified. "Think of them as living gaps, creatures that feed on the moments when human consciousness briefly lapses. Every time you blink, every time your attention wavers, they gain strength and substance in our world." "But what do they want?" Catherine asked. Dr. Crane's expression darkened. "That's what worries me, Mrs. Thompson. In every case I've studied, these entities weren't content to simply observe. They were preparing. Preparing for what? To cross over completely, to become permanent fixtures in our reality. And they typically choose families, children especially, as their anchors to our world." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Jamie, their 10-year-old daughter, was not just a witness to these events. She was the target. "There has to be something we can do," David said, desperation creeping into his voice. "There is, but it's dangerous. These entities are strongest in darkness, weakest in constant light. If we can force a confrontation, expose them to sustained illumination, we might be able to drive them away." "Or," Oliver asked, "or we might make them angry enough to accelerate their timeline." That night, the Thompson family prepared for war. They gathered every light source they could find: flashlights, lanterns, even construction work lights borrowed from David's contractor friend. Dr. Crane helped them position the equipment strategically around their property. "Remember, the goal is to eliminate all shadows, all dark spaces where these entities can hide or gain strength," she explained. "When they appear, we flood the area with light and maintain it no matter what happens." As darkness fell, they took their positions. David and Oliver at the front of the house, Catherine and Dr. Crane at the back, with Jamie safely inside, surrounded by battery-powered lights. At 11:47 p.m., exactly on schedule, they came. But this time, there weren't just a few figures. The entire street seemed to fill with tall shadows, dozens of them, emerging from every dark corner and hidden space. They surrounded the house completely, a silent army of darkness closing in. "Now," Dr. Crane shouted. The night exploded into brilliant light. Every bulb, every lamp, every flashlight activated simultaneously, turning the Thompson property into a blazing beacon visible for miles. The shadows recoiled, writhing and twisting as if in pain. But instead of retreating, they began to solidify. The entities were using the light energy, converting it into substance, becoming more real with each passing second. "This isn't working," David yelled over the humming of the electrical equipment. "They're getting stronger." Dr. Crane's face was pale with realization. "I was wrong. They don't feed on darkness. They feed on attention. Every time we look at them, every time we acknowledge their presence, we're giving them power." "Then how do we stop them?" Catherine cried. The answer came from an unexpected source. Jamie's voice, clear and unafraid, rang out from inside the house. "You have to ignore them. Daddy, don't look. Don't blink. Don't give them what they want." From the mouth of a 10-year-old came the wisdom that had eluded adults and experts. The entities existed in the space between sight and blindness, but more than that, they existed in the space between ignorance and acknowledgement. "Turn off the lights," David commanded. "Everyone close your eyes. Don't look at them. Don't think about them." One by one, the lights went out. The family stood in darkness, eyes closed, minds deliberately emptied of fear and recognition. It was the hardest thing any of them had ever done, to stand defenseless in the presence of terror and simply ignore it. Minutes passed in silence. No movement, no sounds, no indication that anything supernatural was occurring. When they finally opened their eyes, the street was empty. The figures were gone. But more importantly, the feeling of being watched, the oppressive presence that had haunted them for days, had lifted completely. "Is it over?" Jamie asked, stepping onto the front porch. Dr. Crane examined the area carefully, checking for any residual signs of the entity's presence. The footprints, the handprints, even the scratches on the door, had vanished as completely as their creators. "I believe so," she said finally. "By refusing to acknowledge them, you broke their connection to our reality. They can only exist when they're perceived, when they're given substance through fear and attention." The Thompson family spent the next few weeks gradually returning to normal life. The insurance company paid for repairs to their door and windows, though David never explained the real cause of the damage. Detective Shaw filed a report attributing the strange occurrences to unexplained environmental factors, a conclusion that satisfied no one but closed the case officially. Jamie recovered the quickest, as children often do. She returned to school, made new friends, and rarely spoke of their supernatural visitors. But sometimes, late at night, David would find her standing by her bedroom window, looking out at the empty driveway. "Do you see anything out there, sweetheart?" he would ask. "No, Daddy," she would reply with a smile. "There's nothing there at all." And that, David realized, was exactly the point. The shadow in the driveway had taught them a valuable lesson about the nature of fear itself. Some terrors exist only when we feed them with our attention, our acknowledgement, our belief in their power over us. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply look away. But on quiet nights, when the wind carries whispers through empty streets, David still finds himself avoiding mirrors in darkened rooms, and he never ever lets his car's dashcam battery run low. Because some shadows, once acknowledged, never truly disappear. They simply wait in the spaces between blinks for the next moment of human weakness. And in Millbrook, where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are harder to keep than promises, the Thompson family learned that some secrets are best left forgotten. The shadow in the driveway was gone, but the memory of it, the knowledge that such things exist in the corners of our perception, that memory would stay with them forever. A reminder that reality is far stranger and far more fragile than any of us dare to imagine. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, when the world is quiet and still, if you listen carefully, you can hear the footsteps of things that should not be, walking through the darkness, searching for someone, anyone, willing to see them, willing to give them life through fear, willing to blink. Thank you for listening to The Shadow in the Driveway, Story 3 in our collection of school horror tales. Remember, some things are better left unseen, and some shadows are best left unexplored. Sleep well, and try not to think about what might be standing in your driveway, waiting for you to come home.